Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. My name is Zachary Taby. I'm a librarian here at the Northeast Harbor Library. Before we get started, I just wanted to share that we're able to offer programs like this for free all year round, thanks to the generosity of our donors and the vibrant creative community on this island. This is the first of 4 summer lectures with the MDI Historical Society. If you'd like to see more about the library's upcoming programs, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. There is a sheet on that table right near the door, along with some wonderful materials from the Historical Society and the new edition of Chebacco. Now to introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to pass things over to Rainey Bench, the Executive Director of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society.
Hello, thank you all for being here this evening. Thanks to Zach and all the team here for being so welcoming for us. We have extensive partnerships with all of the libraries every other week throughout the entire season. So if you're interested, we have a list of our programs at the back. We share the same values as the libraries. We are stewards of island history, not owners. Everything we do is free and open to the public and accessible to everyone. So all of our programming is free, and that is also, as Zach mentioned, thanks to amazing donors that we have supporting us. So just a couple of quick shout outs. I do have the full public program series that's at the back. If you want to grab one, it's also on our website. And then coming up, I'm actually going to be giving a lecture in Southwest Harbor at the Public Library on Tuesday, June 25th about our housing history and how that informs our future. So you're welcome to join us for that conversation there at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. And then finally, I just want to mention we, for the first time, are doing program surveys to get feedback on your thoughts. I know everybody's like surveyed out all the time, but we're just doing it for 1 year. And we would really appreciate your feedback. It helps us understand the best times to offer the type of subject material you'd be interested in, and then feedback for our services. And so we can constantly try to offer things you're interested in. So the MDI Historical Society produces a journal every year called Chebacco, which is named after one of the first European boats to bring settlers up Somes Sound and into the village of what became Somesville. Each year we produce this journal. There's about 12 articles of new scholarship written by community historians who volunteer their time and their expertise and their perspectives to be able to write about these different topics on the island. So this year the theme was MDI inspired. I think it's incredible that this 108 square mile island really extensive editing period that goes through each one of these articles. So as you have an opportunity to hear from the authors through these public programs, know that you'll get a little bit of a summary of the article. So if you haven't read it, it gives you a nice bit of information, but it also allows you to have access to the information that had to get cut. And so it will enhance that for you. So tonight, I'm really excited to introduce Carl Little, who is going to be talking about Cabot Wheelwright in his article. And he also serves as a volunteer on our editorial board. And so I'm really grateful for Carl's expertise and his time with so many different aspects of Chebacco's success. In addition to this article, Carl has just recently released a book on the art of Penobscot Bay by Island Port Press, and he'll be here in the fall signing books. So you'll have a chance to maybe look for that this summer and then keep an eye out for his book signing here at the library in the fall. Thank you all very much. Carl, welcome.
Yeah, darkness at noon, they used to call it at Dartmouth. the slideshow. Thanks to the Northeast Harbor Library, Amy Weishart presiding, and the MDI Historical Society, Rainey Bench presiding, for organizing this talk. Kudos to the library and the society for championing, I sound like, what's his name there? You know who I'm talking about. Championing the cultural history of this island. And I also want to thank Zach for doing the AV. I'm pleased to be able to share some of my findings and a few outtakes from a fairly deep dive into the life of Mary Cabot Wheelwright, drawing from my essay in the 2024 edition of Chebacco. I want to acknowledge upfront the editing and fine-tuning of Catherine Schmidt, Eloise Schultz, and Rainey Bench. See if I can find this here. There we go. I also want to thank Leatrice Armstrong, author of this outstanding biography of Wheelwright, published in 2016 by the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian in Santa Fe. I cribbed a lot from her account of Wheelwright's life and turned to her for help with images for the article. She also met with my surrogate, former MDI Historical Society Director Tim Garrity, at the Wheelwright Museum to help identify photographs related to Wheelwright's life in Maine. In her preface to the book, Armstrong touches on the highlights of the life she will present in her forthright and compelling biography. A portrait takes shape of a wealthy Boston-born and raised woman whose life bridged the 19th and 20th centuries. Amidst this summary of Wheelwright's life, Armstrong notes her subject's lifelong connections to Mount Desert Island. Summer she spent sailing her yacht off the coast of Maine, she writes, living in her family vacation cottage, other side in Northeast Harbor, and later in a small cottage called the White Hen on Sutton's Island. Maine served as a place of retreat and relaxation. As Wheelwright wrote in her unpublished memoir, Journey Toward Understanding, my particular release and joy in the East was sailing and cruising on the sea in the summer. At the same time, Wheelwright's seasonal homes provided opportunities to further her exploration of the cultures of indigenous people, an enduring quest that, as you will see, connected the desert and the sea. This is Rockwell Kent designed this bookplate for Wheelwright sometime in the early 1920s. In 1882, when Wheelwright was 4 years old, one of the most celebrated artists of the time, Frank Duveneck, painted her portrait. Duveneck had gained stature in the art world by moving away from the romanticism of the Hudson River School to a more direct approach to subjects. A sought-after portraitist, he was known for his renderings of society figures. The same year this portrait was painted, Wheelwright had her first experience on a sailboat. In an undated typed memoir, Early Yachting Days at Northeast Harbor, she noted that she began sailing at the age of 4, quote, tied by a rope to the mast of my father's little yacht, Sylph, off the coast of Beverly Farms in the North Shore region of Massachusetts. Imagining the diminutive figure in the Duveneck painting, roped to a mast, is at once remarkable and somewhat disturbing. This is Duveneck's Mary Cabot Wheelwright, 1882, from the Brooklyn Museum. And I might mention, this is a really large portrait. It actually measures 50 high by 33 wide. It was Sylph that led the Wheelwright family to establish seasonal roots in Maine. In the summer of 1897, Andrew Wheelwright, a wealthy Bostonian, avid yachtsman, arrived in Northeast Harbor with his wife on a cruise aboard that yacht. And according to his daughter, quote, fell in love with it at first sight and bought his point of land as soon as he could do so from Mr. Joseph H. Curtis of Boston. The Wheelwrights turned to local architect Frederick Lincoln Savage to design a house. Celebrated for his shingle-style residences, Savage built a 3-story, 10,000 square foot cottage.
Oh, I'm sure, but you know, that doesn't mean
rooms. This is a photograph of Frederick Savage in his studio in Bar Harbor around 1898. The family joined the rusticators their lives centered around sailing. Mary Wheelwright's recollections of yachting days in Maine include invocations of specific vessels and voyages, and rowing. We all rowed a lot in those days, and the harbor was quite a meeting place at sunset time. Kind of a nice thing to think about. Wheelwright also recalled J.P. Morgan's 180-foot-long steamer Corsair arriving in the harbor with great fanfare. She remembered Loring Kimball's father's fascinating old marine store smelling of all tarry seafaring things, and the busy little Islesford steamer making her daily tour from island to island and to the wharf at Northeast Harbor, good lobstering in the harbor, and passersby jeering at sloops and catboats stuck on the bare island ledge. Soon after setting down seasonal routes, Wheelwright's father bought half the shares in the Fanny Earl, a small coasting schooner built by Eugene Stanley in front of his house on Sutton Island. So for many years, we had great fun with her, Wheelwright recounted, and father avoided the care of a yacht. Larger vessels did, however, come along, starting with Hesper, measuring 104 feet long. The 1884 pilot boat, number 5, was the largest under the American flag and the fastest of the Boston fleet. Mr. Wheelwright purchased the ship in 1901 and took her to Maine. With Frank Sperling from Islesford as captain, the Wheelwrights cruised up and down the Maine coast on Hesper. After her parents died, Wheelwright sailed with Sperling to Nova Scotia and into Passamaquoddy Bay. Quote, "With its tides," she wrote, "which made sailing without power quite exciting." This wood engraving records the September, it's by J. Davidson. It records the September 26, 1889 race off Boston Harbor between Hesper on the right and the fishing schooner Fredonia, which was owned by John Malcolm Forbes. The race was for $6,000. The Fredonia won. Wheelwright concludes her early yachting days at Northeast Harbor with an eloquent and heartfelt complaint. She felt that the addition of motors to sailboats ruined the, quote, "wonderful and restful quiet of the sea at Northeast Harbor." She preferred, quote, "no sounds but the creak of oars or flap of sail and the voices of the talking tide against the roads." She also believed that being able to motor diminished the romance of the sea. "If sailing boats have power, there is little art in sailing them," she wrote. "It isn't by making everything easy that life is more interesting," Wheelwright mused. "It's the game that man played with wind and sea that was fascinating and bred patience, ingenuity, and skill that was as wonderful as that of a great pianist." After her parents died, her father in 1908, her mother in 1917, Wheelwright came out from under their shadow and became the adventuresome figure that is now her recognized persona. In 1919, at age 41, she made her first solo trip to the Southwest. She had been to California with her parents in 1897 and traversed the Grand Canyon on horseback with friends in 1914. On her early forays, Wheelwright stayed at the San Gabriel Ranch on the banks of the Rio Grande in Alcalde, New Mexico. This dude ranch offered guided camping trips, which Wheelwright enjoyed. Smitten with desert life, she purchased Los Luceros, the Stars in English, an historic hacienda located north of Alcalde on the Rio Grande River. She spent part of nearly every year in residence there for the rest of her life. The hacienda was designated an historic site in 2019. This is what it looks like today. And here's a photograph of the hacienda's Gran Sala, or Great Hall, as it looked in Wheelwright's day and currently above and below. In the bottom photo, on the near wall on the right, you can see Frank Duvenek's portrait of the 4-year-old Mary Wheelwright right there. On a visit to the Navajo reservation in 1921, Francis Newcomb, an advocate of Navajo culture and customs, introduced Wheelwright to Hastiin Klah, an esteemed Navajo spiritual leader and celebrated weaver, sand painter, and ceremonial singer. Their friendship would become the inspiration for and the focal point of Wheelwright's life purpose, to preserve the rituals and knowledge associated with Navajo spirituality. I should note that the term Navajo comes from Spanish missionaries and historians who refer to the Pueblo Indians through this term, which derives from the word Navajo, which combines the roots Nava, field, and Hu, valley, to mean large field. It was borrowed into Spanish to refer to an area of present-day northwestern New Mexico, and later into English for the Navajo tribe and their language. The Navajo refer to themselves as the Dine, meaning the people. This is a portrait of Hastiin Klah from the Wheelwright Museum. Frances Newcomb played a key role in Wheelwright's efforts to understand the Navajo, drawing on her extensive connections with the tribe, including her close ties to Klah, a biography of whom she published in 1964. She studied the sand paintings in the Navajo ceremonies and drew them from memory. These efforts led to a number of publications and the eventual creation of the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian in Santa Fe. This is a photo of Hastiin Klah with Newcomb, probably at Los Lucheros around 1935, again from the Wheelwright Museum. Having gradually earned the trust of Klah and others, Newcomb was allowed to observe rituals from which non-Indians had been strictly excluded. These included sand painting ceremonies in which complex colored patterns were painstakingly rendered in sand, then promptly destroyed at the end of the ceremony. At first, as a silent observer, she memorized features of the sand paintings, then made drawings afterwards. She writes, "Since pencil, paper, or camera were not allowed in the lodge, I had only my memory to depend on. In later years, I trained myself to concentrate, and if allowed to remain in ceremonial hogan for a half hour, I could reproduce the painting without an error." With Klah's and others' approval, she gained increasing access and was eventually permitted to record about 500 sand paintings, which she recreated in paint on board. Some Navajos opposed this, condemning it as sacrilege, but Klah consented cautiously. 44 of these were reproduced in her first book, Sand Paintings of the Navajo Shooting Chant, 1937, while other paintings of her were preserved and are now exhibited in the Wheelwright Museum. While respectful of the rituals and traditions of the Navajo, Newcomb also helped them cope with the diseases introduced by whites. Often traveling to remote hogans, the traditional dwellings of the Navajo, to provide modern medicines, she became known as Atse Ashan, or medicine woman. This is one of Newcomb's remarkable drawings of a sand painting made from memory. Klah often accompanied Wheelwright during her many sojourns in the Southwest, but he also came to Maine as her guest. His trip to Northeast Harbor in 1931 is among the most memorable episodes in Armstrong's biography and provides a direct connection between the two lodestars of Wheelwright's life, the desert and the sea. Part of Wheelwright's motive for bringing Klah to Maine was to increase his stature among the Navajo. At about this time, she wrote, "When Klah was doing so much in giving me information on where to find certain ceremonials and the proper medicine man for each one, I decided I would give him great pleasure by bringing him to the Atlantic Ocean. It would give him great prestige among the Indians to have visited both the Pacific and Atlantic." The trip east was not without challenges. Frances Newcomb recounted how from Wisconsin to Northeast Harbor, Klah and his nephew and apprentice, Clyde Bale, were, quote, classed as colored and could enter very few dining places and no hotels whatsoever. During their 2-week stay with Wheelwright in Northeast Harbor, the two Navajo men lodged in a nearby boathouse, accommodations that, according to their host, allowed them to be independent. "But they ate with us," she noted. Wheelwright described her guests' costume as follows. Klah wore his traditional dress of cotton trousers and lovely velveteen blouse, his silver necklace and belt, and looked wonderful against the background of the Maine woods. Klah spent time wandering among the spruce trees and studying local flora, but he was especially fascinated by the sea. Newcomb recounted how one day he asked her for a glass fruit jar and then waded knee-deep into the water, stooped and filled it with the sand, pebbles, and crushed shell that was under the water. When asked why he did this, Klah replied, "It is a symbol of the land that holds the ocean, and it is very powerful." This is Clyde Bale and Hastiin Klah on Seal Harbor Beach, 1931. During his stay, Wheelwright asked Klah to make a sand painting on the terrace of her Northeast Harbor home. He created a house blessing design using white sandstone collected in the hills nearby. The sand along the shore, he said, would cut his fingers. In a short video highlighting Klah's visit to Maine, Wheelwright describes another sand painting made on her terrace, The Black Wind, a Navajo design surrounded by snakes. She reported that, quote, several people came to see it. They protected the sand painting from a north wind for several days using a barrier of chairs and so forth. Klah, she reports, was fascinated with the wild animal tracks that appeared on his sand painting, including a snake, which meant the snake, you see, had answered the sand painting, quote. Here is Klah with a sand painting tapestry. The 8-foot by 8-foot tapestry is titled Angled Corn with Holy People, Night Wave Ceremony, and dates from the early 1930s. Made of hand-spun wool with indigenous and aniline dyes, the tapestry is from the Dr. Howard and Catherine Cockrell collection in Arkansas. It was Francis Newcomb who suggested Klah might consider weaving monumental rugs that would replicate ceremonial sand paintings. Reluctant at first, he eventually agreed, providing that they would be displayed respectfully as wall tapestries, not as rugs to be walked on. Klah's first such tapestry was purchased by the wife of King Gillette, who had made a fortune from his invention of a razor with disposable blades, the iconic Gillette razor. Klah's second tapestry was purchased by Mary Wheelwright. By the time of his death in 1937, Klah had woven 25 large tapestries based on ceremonial sand paintings. In the same video, Wheelwright mentions that her cousin, Mrs. Ray Slater Murphy, who had been to one of Klah's ceremonies in New Mexico, invited the group to a Japanese tea ceremony in her genuine tea house in Seal Harbor, overseen by a Japanese tea master. Klah was entirely at ease and enjoyed the Japanese ceremonial eating, which came naturally to him, she relates. When they returned to Wheelwright's house, Klah told her that he was sure his great god, Begochiti, was in Maine because it smelled so sweet. Left to right here, Robin, that's James Murphy, Hastiin Klah, and then Ray Murphy, and then Clyde Bale seated at the Japanese tea ceremony at the Murphy's Tea House in Seal Harbor. Alice Murphy gave me that photo. Wheelwright also took Klah and Bale sailing. They were frightened at first, she related, but about a fortnight before they left, they were going out on my schooner and enjoying it intensely when the spray flew over them. This is Mary Wheelwright rowing Clyde and Hastiin Klah in Northeast Harbor, 1931. One evening during the visit, Wheelwright organized a reception for Klah. The names of the guests look like a page of who's who from Boston, Newcomb recounted. Klah and Bale provided the entertainment, the former singing while the latter beat a drum. Wheelwright spoke about the vibrancy of Navajo religion, and Newcomb shared some of her sand painting sketches. As I gazed at the polite faces and the fixed smiles of the guests, Newcomb recounted, I realized that this was just another lecture to most of them and carried no special meaning. Certain aspects of Wheelwright's and Klah's relationship, and specifically the visit to Northeast Harbor, smack of exploitation, a wealthy woman showing off her Indian. On the other hand, she had enormous respect and love for him, quote, for his real goodness, generosity, and holiness, for there is no other word for it, as she wrote. Klah, in turn, accepted the attentions of this unconventional Bostonian, who, like him, wanted to preserve his culture. Anthropologist Gladys Reichard noted that Klah valued our technical devices for preservation, writing, painting in watercolor, phonograph recording, and not only cooperated with recorders, but even urged that the teaching be made permanent. Wheelwright's interest in indigenous cultures included the Wabanaki. Working with Maine author and anthropologist Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, she collected Wabanaki artwork. Ekstrom, who had learned from some of their languages and wrote about the Penobscot on many occasions, served as an agent for acquiring items for Wainwright. The Northeast Harbor Library's archives includes a copy of the correspondence of the two women, which Wheelwright saved. In those letters, Ekstrom reported on her efforts to purchase items on behalf of Wheelwright, recounting her road trips to Washington County in search of baskets and crooked knives, canoes, even wigwams. Funny stuff, this collecting, Ekstrom wrote. It doesn't matter what you start out to get. The result is always the same, that the chief pleasure in it is the work of it. Wheelwright donated a large part of her Wabanaki collection to what was then the Abbe Museum of Stone Age Antiquities in Bar Harbor in 1931. In the catalog of the collection, The Handicrafts of the Modern Indians of Maine, first published in 1932, Ekstrom carefully described each object, including this birch bark box made by Toma Joseph, a Passamaquoddy artist. It's made from birch bark, ash, iron nails, and pine from the Abbe Museum's collection, a gift of Mary Wheelwright. Ekstrom shared Wheelwright's fascination with indigenous medicine men. Her book, Old John Neptune and Other Maine Indian Shamans, 1945, which was dedicated to Wheelwright, looks at the life of Neptune, shaman and governor and hereditary chief of the Penobscot tribe. On a recent Maine Calling segment, you may have heard this, Maine basket makers Teresa Secord and Jeremy Fry both credited the Abbe Museum with supporting their work over the years by showing and selling it. I like to think Ekstrom's collecting and Wheelwright's gift of the Wabanaki work to the museum helped pave the way to the recent appreciation of Maine's indigenous artists, including the landmark exhibition Jeremy Frey, Woven, currently at the Portland Museum of Art. These are two pieces. I saw the show the other day. It's just unbelievable. These are two pieces from the show, which runs through September 15th. On the left is Basket with Cover, 2003, ash, sweetgrass, and synthetic dyes from the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. And on the right is Watchful Spirit, 2022, ash, porcupine quills, sweetgrass, and dye from the Denver Art Museum, which commissioned its creation. In the closing text for the Wheelwright collection catalog, Ekstrom wrote, "One learns to respect not only the craftsmanship of the Indian, but his mastery of color and design. And anyone who tries to reproduce one of them will have at least taught himself the lesson of knowing the difference between hastily contrived, cheap articles offered for sale to unthinking purchasers and the really good designs and workmanship of which the Indian is still capable if there is a demand for artistic work." Wheelwright shared Ekstrom's disdain for commercial replicas. Armstrong devotes a chapter of her biography to Wheelwright's efforts to encourage Navajo artists to work from traditional motifs using time-honored techniques rather than producing cheaply made knockoffs. Her advocacy included calling for vegetable instead of synthetic dyes for weavings. Wheelwright's efforts to try and improve native arts carry more than a whiff of colonial-like sovereignty that persists today. The idea that Indians have to be traditional ignores the adaptations they must make for survival. That said, her actions seem well-intended. "My object," she wrote, "was to help in producing a more beautiful but not too expensive blanket. Otherwise, the industry would not pay." Wheelwright's contributions to Navajo art were highlighted in the exhibition Forgotten Connections, Maine's Role in the Navajo Textile Trade, 1880-1930 at the University of Maine's Hudson Museum in 1990. Not only, the curators wrote, not only did Wheelwright's suggestions boost the slumping textile trade by returning it to its beginnings, even today, contemporary pieces continue to reflect her influence. This is a photo of Philomene Solis Nelson, Teresa Secor's great-grandmother, selling baskets on Indian Island in 1953. Secor has written, ours is a community art form in that the mentoring and the economy surrounding the traditional materials access takes place within the Wabanaki community. In her advocacy work as the head of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, Secor helped organize mentor basket makers who then helped bring forward a new generation of basket makers in the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, and Micmac tribes. Wheelwright contributed to the Northeast Harbor and greater Mount Desert Island community in a number of ways, mostly within the purview of a wealthy summer resident. In her book, The Gentle Americans, Biography of a Breed, 1965, cultural historian Helen Howe mentions Wheelwright's support on many levels of the Maine Seacoast mission, where she conveyed care for isolated islanders similar to that shown for the Navajo. She also supported this library and, as mentioned, donated much of her Wabanaki collection to the Abbe Museum. When she needed money to build a museum in Santa Fe, Wheelwright raised part of it by selling her parents' home in Northeast Harbor. She also sold Navajo craft work in carry-on shops, kind of like thrift shops, in Boston and Northeast Harbor to support charities for the Navajo. This is the carry-on shop ad in the directory and handbook of Northeast Harbor, Bar Harbor, Soamesville, and adjacent islands from 1951. After the sale of Other Side, Sutton Island became Wheelwright's main home. Her connection to the island had begun when her father built her a one-room tea house on the North Shore in 1895. According to George Payne, Sutton Island historian, Wheelwright often teed there until she purchased the White Hen with 9 acres of land from the Rice family in 1919. Payne also relates that Wheelwright sold the tea house in 1930 to Nelson Rockefeller and John French Jr., Dartmouth classmates, who then gave it to Ernest Hopkins, the former college president, who lived in Manset in the summer. This is the White Hen, Wheelwright's home, around 1939. According to Wheelwright's biographer, Armstrong, the White Hen got its name from the way it sat on the ground. I love that. Throughout her life, Wheelwright sought out the company of writers and artists, including novelist and poet Rachel Field, poet Abby Houston Evans, and painter and printmaker Ruth Starr Rose, all of whom spent time with her on Sutton Island. The last named, Ruth Starr Rose, represents one of those tangents I was tempted to follow as I researched this essay. I had never heard of her and was fascinated to learn that, like Wheelwright, Rose had been devoted to another culture. She is best known for her paintings of African Americans in Maryland in the 1930s and 1940s. This is a photo of Rose with one of her lithographs, Bound for Glory, from around 1940. It's fodder for another article someday. Rachel Field had a home on Sutton Island and was close friends with Wheelwright. Indeed, according to the aforementioned Helen Howe, Wheelwright had told Field that she was going to leave her the White Hen in her will, little thinking that the much younger woman would predecease her by many years. The Cranberry Isles served as a muse for Field, inspiring some of her best-known writings, including the poem, If Once You Have Slept on an Island, and the biographical novel, God's Pocket. This is a photograph of Rachel Field on a dock on Sutton Island, part of the collection of the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. Born in Bristol, Maine, Abby Houston Evans had been Edna St. Vincent Millay's Sunday school teacher in Camden and gained national recognition for her verse, which poet Louise Bourgain compared to that of Gerard Manley Hopkins and Emily Dickinson. I inherited a love of her poetry from my uncle, the painter William Keenbush, who championed her work and was instrumental in her receiving the Maine State Award in the 1960s. Evans's poem, For One Without Fear, is an elegy for Wheelwright, who died on Sutton Island from coronary thrombosis on July 29th, 1958, at age 79. In the poem, Evans grieves the sudden loss of her friend. The verse ends with this salute to Wheelwright in her home in Maine. Left back in time, along with us, the things she knew, the fog, the sun, the desert, and the sea. In the long-lived, swift, relinquished room with the shut book lying and the Hittite seals, with its dead honest word, the worn and handled pebble speaks of her. Evans read this poem, which appears in her final book, Fact of Crystal, 1963, at the Library of Congress on January 22nd, 1964, and you can find that online. It's quite wonderful. She continued to visit the White Hen as a guest of Anita Boardman, to whom Wheelwright left her house. And I really wasn't able to find out anything about Anita Boardman. One of Wheelwright's island neighbors, Rosamond Lamb, described Wheelwright's final leave-taking from Sutton. It was a very foggy day, she wrote, and her little motorboat came up to the float, and they carried the coffin down and put it on the boat, and she steamed out into the fog, and it was really just what she would have liked. Could anything be more appropriate for Mary than just to go out into the void like that in the deep fog, just by herself in a boat? This is you probably can't read it, but it's the brief obituary of the Sutton Island authoress that appeared in the local papers. Wheelwright makes a number of appearances in Daniel Payne's Orion on the Dunes, a biography of Henry Beston, published in 2016. She hosted author and naturalist Beston and his wife, writer Elizabeth Coatsworth, at her homes in New Mexico and in Maine. She introduced them to Navajo culture and to Hastiin Klah and took them sailing. This photo, taken in 1930, shows Wheelwright and Beston reclining on the deck of Lyria with Frank Sperling from Islesford at the helm. Beston dedicated what is perhaps his most important book, The Outermost House, 1928, to Wheelwright. It's a fitting tribute. They shared a love of nature and a need to remove themselves from the so-called civilized world. Wheelwright traced her passion for the natural world to her Cabot ancestors. Quote, "My mother's family for a good many generations had a strong interest in nature and a need to get away from civilization, if possible to some place that was virgin, that had never been explored," she wrote. For that reason, she felt her family expressed no surprise in her embracing a primitive people, although her Boston peers may not have understood her infatuation. "My feeling is that people are moved too much by theory and so-called science," she observed, "and too little by warmth, enthusiasm, and the intuition that makes one man different from another man." Wheelwright embraced life outdoors. The feeling of being part of the earth when you slept on it night after night was an enormous experience, she wrote. It made it so much more possible to understand the connection, intimate and consoling, of the Indian to his earth. We have put so much between us and the earth. This photo shows Clara Bentley, Mary Wheelwright, and Orville Cox at the Newcomb Trading Post in Navajo, New Mexico, around 1925. I'll get over those fur coats. Yeah, I mean, no. As I noted in my essay in Chebacco, Southwest Harbor resident Alberta Willie first led me to Mary Wheelwright through an album she had been given, which featured photographs of Klah's visit to Northeast Harbor. At my suggestion, Willie gave the album to the Wheelwright Museum in Santa Fe, its rightful home. Interesting to note that Alberta's son, Tom Willie, a documentary filmmaker, made this 2018 film about nationally recognized Passamaquoddy artist David Moses Bridges. It offers a very moving account of Bridges' fight to preserve his heritage, culture, and family while facing cancer. And I can't recommend it enough. It's a beautiful film. In honor of Pride Month, I wanted to share with you my recent discovery that Wheelwright's life story has found a place in queer history. In the fall 2019 edition of El Palacio, a magazine devoted to the art, history, and culture of the Southwest, writer Ethan Ortega relates, "There is no documentation that Wheelwright's sexuality strayed from cultural norms at the time. However, there is clear evidence that her gender expression did. After establishing roots in New Mexico, Wheelwright publicly embraced roles considered to be both masculine and feminine, stating that, quote, it was possible to be a good sport and also drink tea. After purchasing a weaving by Hastiin Klah in 1921, Ortega writes, Wheelwright developed a friendship with the artist. As a teenager, and I find this just fascinating, Klah was recognized as, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but Nadli-Chi, Nadli-He, which is a third gender or non-binary term used by the Navajo. Francis Newcomb wrote that the Navajo believed Klah to be honored by the gods and to possess unusual mental capacity, combining both male and female attributes. He was expected to master all the knowledge, skill, and leadership of a man, and also all the skills, ability, and intuition of a woman. Klah, during his lifetime, lived up to those expectations in every way. As a third gender individual, Klah was able to provide a perspective encompassing both male and female cultural traditions. Between 1931 and 1937, Klah visited Los Lucheros regularly and collaborated with Wheelwright to create a museum focused on documenting and preserving Navajo culture. Together, they created the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. This is a photo of Hastiin Klah with Mary Wheelwright taken by Francis Newcomb in Phoenix around 1928. And this is a view of the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. This photo shows Wheelwright entering El Santuario de Chemayo, a Roman Catholic shrine in Chemayo, New Mexico. When we consider Wheelwright's legacy, one can argue that her commitment to indigenous cultures played a crucial role in raising awareness of worldviews and peoples who in the minds of most have been either forgotten or presumed destined to assimilation. She shed her proper Bostonian heritage and took to the desert and the sea in order to find herself. She bridged more than centuries. She spanned cultures. Wheelwright's life, as she put it, was a journey towards understanding. Thank you. Questions? I really have to recommend the Armstrong biography if you want to know a lot about Mary Wheelwright. It's really wonderful, both the positive and the negative. She was a very interesting individual, and she had some habits that rubbed people very wrong. She had a habit of giving people nicknames, which drove some people nuts. So there's some wonderful accounts of that in the book. But she was a very, very interesting. Did anybody here know of her before this, or, yeah?
I ran across her because I was writing a play about Maria Chebacco and her relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe.
Right.
And in fact, there's a show that's touring New Mexico right now that I wrote, and Wheelwright is actually sort of the narrator.
Oh, wow.
Based on the letters between Georgia O'Keeffe and Maria Chebacco. But she really took a lot of women under her wing, young, either lesbian women or widowed women that never remarried, single young women. She supported them financially, mentored them, and Maria was, she was scheduled to sort of inherit that ranch.
I remember that.
Yeah, but I suspect she may have been autistic. That nickname thing is a trait of autism.
Ah,
And then also the gender ambiguity, and the fact she didn't seem to ever have partners or anything.
yeah.
I don't know, there's just things about her that made me wonder if she was on the spectrum.
Interesting. Did somebody else? Yeah.
Carl, many decades ago, we had an electrician that came and he was telling me that when he was a young man apprentice electrician, he was called to the other side to fix a electrical line that was going with water. And there was a cocktail party taking place at the house. And that Klah was in full headdress. And he thought it was maybe eagle feather. Is that possible?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is interesting because the album that Alberta Willie brought to me and wanted to know what it was. It's an album of photographs of Klah's visit to Northeast Harbor. And one of the things that really struck me, but I couldn't get it for the article, was some photographs of Klah actually doing the sand painting on the terrace. And I was told by the museum that they're not allowed to show those because it was something that you didn't do. It really was sacrilegious in a way. I mean, Klah did it as a friend of Mary Wheelwright's, but you can tell from the accounts I gave, she'd have her friends over to look at it, and this was a no-no. And so they wouldn't allow me to. They're great photos. I mean, Klah in his dress, out and, like overlooking the harbor doing, making the sand painting. My God. And so I suggested to Alberta that the album should definitely go to the museum, which she did.
But in your research, did you ever find a photograph of the house? We have looked and never found it.
No, and I couldn't under Charles Savage. Nothing that I could. I'm sure there's something somewhere.
Everybody's been looking and nobody's ever found it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
The house has been photographed.
And he was such a major architect, and no, it's the same thing with that Anita Boardman, who Wheelwright left her house to. I can't find anything about her. I mean, little snippets here and there, but not like an obituary, or we'd really like to know.
I spent my childhood with her.
What's that?
I spent my childhood with her.
With Anita Boardman?
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Here it is. Tell us about her.
She was a wonderful woman. She was very old by the time I knew her. Our house is next door to the field house on Sutton.
Okay.
And so Mrs. Boardman was friends with my parents. And she was by that time quite elderly and had a female companion named Alice Washburn, who used to go sailing with her.
Wow.
And took care of her and was an extraordinary woman in her own right. So there were a lot of these situations on Sutton where Bostonian women who had obviously either outlived their husbands or never had any would summer on these houses. Lyman was next door, Mrs. Lyman was next door.
Oh, yeah.
And they were all very interesting people. What I don't know is anything about her provenance because I was too young.
Yeah.
I can tell you all about her, but she was quite at that time old and
Yeah, I was really curious. It's an incredible island because another one of my favorite poets spent time out there, Hortense Flexner, who was a friend of Margaret Yersinar's.
she taught me how to make gingerbread.
Damn. No way. That's wonderful. Yeah, and and I mentioned Abby Houston Evans. She's very special to me as a poet. I recommend and I take any chance I can to promote her work. She wrote 3 very slim volumes of verse, and then there's a collected from the University of Pittsburgh. But she is a terrific poet, and if I'd had time, there's one of my favorite poems of hers is called Northern Lights over Sutton Island. It's just this description, just like what we've had recently, it's just the sky is alive. And anyway, any other questions or? Sure.
Just to be clear, so it was just the one summer and the one visit that she brought her Navajo friends?
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
And every other summer she would return from New Mexico.
Yes.
and have her other artist friends, but now it was just that once.
Yes, Klah only came that one time. And then and that was in the summer, but she generally spent summers in Maine and the winter in New Mexico. Yeah.
Can you explain the sand paintings a little bit more? Is this like a diagram?
It is a lot like that, from my understanding. And it's something that they had all different kinds of designs that they had for particular ceremonies. And I believe like the Buddhist practice, they would do them and then they would destroy them afterwards. And so that's what's so remarkable about Frances Newcomb. I mean, she's worth a whole other story. Being able to remember those designs and recreate them, and so that we have that record of them. Quite amazing. Yeah.
In your article, you talked about the sand that they used. And so he said he couldn't use the sand from the beach, it would cut his fingers.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you had any verses, so that's why he took the sand from the hill.
Yeah.
And I thought, where did he get it from the hills? And
Yeah.
where did it cut his fingers?
I had that same question.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, I think it was like a sandstone, but I don't know where you'd find that
Right,
near here. It said from nearby hills.
yeah.
Sand beach.
Yeah, yes.
What was Newcomb's background? Did she have an academic background?
She was sort of like, no, I shouldn't say she was sort of like Wheelwright. She was very interested in the Navajo culture, both as an anthropologist.
She studied anthropology?
I don't know if she actually studied it. She and her husband had a trading post for a while, which ended up burning down, which sent him to becoming an alcoholic, as I remember. And she went on to work with Wheelwright and introduced her to Klah and everything after that. But there's a lot of literature on her. Her papers are somewhere in the Midwest. I can't remember, but there's an archive of all of her papers. And she did a lot of different things. Wrote the biography of Klah, did the sand paintings, and then apparently also helped people medically, which is kind of amazing. Yeah.
Seems to tell you kind of an interesting way that some of the early modern, American modernist interest in Native American culture. You think of people in New Mexico, Stieglitz Circle,
Marin, Hartley, O'Keefe.
D.H. Lawrence, Mabel Dodge. Is there a broader social context for her in that?
Well, she was friends with O'Keefe. O'Keefe came to visit her at Los Lucheros. But I don't know, I keep finding more connections. It's kind of remarkable. I was in touch with someone recently who made the connection between Abbe Houston Evans and Marcin Hartley, which just blew my mind, two of my favorite human beings. And apparently, Hartley, I think, started the correspondence. His end of the correspondence doesn't exist, but all of Abbe Houston Evans's letters to him are available. And she's talking about seeing a show of his Katahdin paintings, you know. Whoa. But I'm sure that they all knew each other. I mean, it was a pretty, right? I mean, I don't know how far Taos is from Alcalde and stuff like that, but I imagine that they got around. Well, thank you so much.
Great.